Hello, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you all are coming from or calling in from. I am Maki Park, Senior Policy Analyst for Early Education and Care at the Migration Policy Institute, and I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar, Young Children in Refugee Families and Early Childhood Programs, Ways to Mitigate the Effects of Trauma. We're so pleased that you've joined us for this conversation and that so many of you have expressed interest in this very timely topic. I just wanted to go over a few quick housekeeping notes before we get started with the conversation. First, if you are running into any technical difficulties now or over the course of the webinar, please email us at events@migrationpolicy.org or call us at 202-266-1929 and we'll get you sorted out. We also wanted to let you know that we will be holding a question and answer period at the end of the call. This will not be a voice Q&A, but will be moderated via chat. So please type any questions into the Q&A or chat box on the right side of your screen and send to the host or to myself. You can also email questions to event@migrationpolicy.org. Alternatively, if you are on Twitter, you can tweet your questions to @migrationpolicy or use #MPIDiscuss. And these questions can come in over the course of the webinar, so no need to wait until the end of the presentations, though we will wait to address questions until our speakers have had a chance to present. So with that aside, I'm privileged to have the opportunity to be speaking alongside our presenters today, Professor J. Lawrence Aber, or Larry Aber, the Wilner Family Professor in Psychology and Public Policy at New York University, and Heather Savazzi, who is the Content Development Lead at CMAS, which supports the care and settlement of young immigrant and refugee children in Canada. And I'll be introducing both of our distinguished speakers momentarily, but first wanted to give you all just a bit of an introduction and context to the topic of our discussion today. We are hosting this webinar here at the Migration Policy Institute's National Center on Immigrant Integration Policy, where our work covers a range of issues impacting immigrant and refugee outcomes here in the United States. My work at MPI focuses largely on early childhood policies that promote the healthy development and success of young children of immigrants and refugees and dual language learners. And as part of our work on these issues, we recently conducted a study of 9 countries' early childhood education and care policies and practices that are designed to serve young children of refugees and asylum seekers across Europe and North America. We conceived this study in response to the height of the migrant crisis in Europe a few years ago now, and we really sought to answer the question of how mainstream early childhood services could support the integration and success of young refugee and asylum seeker children and their families, as well as how such services could be improved and expanded to mitigate many of the risk factors that these young children face, which we'll be hearing about over the course of the discussion today. And what we found through this research initiative was that overall, in Europe as well as in the United States, not very much was being done at a system level to make sure that young refugee children were accessing high-quality early childhood services. And we saw evidence of many disconnects, which meant that these children were largely invisible in policy and program discussions. And many early childhood programs told us that they lacked the resources and capacity they needed to serve these children and families well. And one of the key areas of weakness that we found across countries was this lack of trauma-informed approaches for young refugee children and their families, in spite of all of the research that's now showing us about the importance of addressing trauma experienced in the early years. So while most early childhood systems and programs recognize the need for early childhood services that take a trauma-informed approach and are able to holistically and appropriately address the socio-emotional and mental health needs of refugee children and their families, we heard across the board that they lacked the information and the support they needed to provide these kinds of services. And we're really excited, too, about the rising interest and visibility of the issue of trauma across the early childhood field. And I know that many of you on this call are likely very knowledgeable on these issues. However, we have seen very little focus in either research or practice that looks specifically at the overlay of the issue of early childhood trauma with the needs of refugee families and what some of the specific and unique needs of this population might be. So this was the impetus of this brief webinar series, which we're holding with support from the Alliance for Early Success. This will be the first of 2 conversations that we'll be hosting at MPI around this topic. And I'm very excited now to turn this over to an expert in the field, Professor Larry Aber. He's going to be leading us through an overview of the potential effects of trauma on young refugee children and the role that ECEC programs might play in addressing some of these impacts. Professor Aber, in addition to being the Wilner Family Professor of Psychology and Public Policy at the Steinhardt School at New York University, is also the co-director of the Global Tides for Children Research Center, a global research initiative, and is an internationally renowned expert in the fields of child development and social policy. We're so grateful to have you join us for this conversation, Larry. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Maki. Thank you, Migration Policy Institute, for this opportunity to share thoughts with all of you on the webinar, and I'm really, really glad to be sharing these thoughts with you. Just one word about my own background. For 40 years, roughly, I have been working on two things. One is understanding how violence affects kid and youth development. And the second is on trying to identify strategies that governments, programs, communities, NGOs can use to address these kinds of issues. So what I'm going to be talking about is the field as a whole, and only a tiny little bit about my own work in it, although you'll hear a little bit of that. So I'm going to provide a brief orientation, then introduce you to two major concepts which many of you probably know about: complex trauma and mass trauma, and then work through some implications and share some resources. Although it almost goes without saying, one must say that children develop, and they develop through multiple stages. I'm going to be using the concept that early childhood extends from birth through the age of 8, that young children are infants, toddlers, and in the early childhood phase of development. But boy, there's an awful lot to talk about. I can't wait for the Migration Policy Institute's K-12 group to be working on these issues in the same way. So I think that would be a terrific thing. The second thing is, most of you are maybe familiar with a framework called the ecology of human development. But the point here is that children develop in the context of many, many systems. And if we're going to think about program and policy interventions, we should not be thinking just about the child, him or herself, but how the child is embedded and nested in their families and schools and peers and their neighborhoods and the connections among them, and all the way out to culture and society. With those two notions, let me first introduce the notion of complex trauma, because when people talk about trauma popularly, they tend to think about an event, a single event that happens a single time with no spillover. So for instance, a car accident happening to a child when they're 12 years old, and that doesn't, beyond the short-term impacts, really radiate out and spill over to affect the rest of their family. Complex trauma is different. It's exposure to multiple and repeated forms of maltreatment and trauma. They're repeated, they exist over time, and there's tons of interpersonal spillover. And the impacts of simple trauma and complex trauma are very different on children. The impacts of complex trauma really provides early childhood workers and many other professionals and others in the field to have a new framework on understanding the role of complex trauma in kids' lives. The first thing to say about the effects is they are not in any single domain of children's development. It affects their attachment relationships with their primary caregivers. It affects their underlying biology and their ability to regulate their emotions, from labeling to expressing emotions in appropriate ways. It can lead in extreme forms to experiences of dissociation, where there's altered states of consciousness even among young children, and impaired memory for certain kinds of memories. Affects their behavioral control. They become aggressive, oppositional. Their cognition is challenged by having a harder time regulating their attention, their executive function, their planfulness, and it their self-esteem and can lead to feelings of shame and guilt. No child necessarily experiencing complex trauma affects all of these. All of these have been well documented in the literature, and many children experience multiple forms of them. The complexity of this kind of trauma, oops, I'm going the wrong way. The complexity of this type of trauma has over time led clinical workers to develop notions of what should be the core components of interventions to treat complex trauma. And those ideas are to promote children's feelings of safety and self-regulation, their ability to be self-reflective about their own thinking, their own information processing, to not carve off traumatic experiences but integrate them into what their understanding is of what's happened to them in their life, to promote engagement with others, because under situations of complex trauma, kids can become isolated and not want to do that, and to help them experience positive emotions in a full and rich way again. So with those complex trauma symptoms, there's a growing body of evidence of the strategies I just described about how to treat them, and I just wanted to leave you with the notion that the general framework for such interventions is something called attachment self-regulation competency intervention model, and they vary somewhat by stage of child. So Alicia Lieberman is perhaps the most famous proponent of interventions that take on this model to address kids' development early in life. But what happens when a trauma is not only complex, but on a very large scale? What happens when kids are in war zones, as many of the refugee and immigrant children that we're talking about have fled from, or in some parts of the world are still in? And how do we think about that? In that situation, complex trauma needs to be complemented with a concept called mass trauma. And Ann Maston, a really respected figure in thinking about all this, describes mass trauma as extreme adversities and conditions that affect large groups of children or adolescents and their families at the same time. So it's repeated over time and spillover, but now happening at a systems level, at a population or community level, happening to many children and their families at the same time. When we think about mass trauma, we think about not only how it affects multiple interacting systems within the child, as we talked about for complex trauma, but we also need to think about the many interactions of individuals with complex and changing contexts, their relationship with others, interrelated systems, and the natural and built environment. And this is beginning to get into why ECE plays such an important role. There's been a growing interest in not wanting to understand the differential effects of complex trauma and mass trauma. And I'm just going to quickly give you an example from my own work. Nearly 20 years ago now, in collaboration with Mona Maksoud in Lebanon, we studied how kids' exposure to the Lebanese Civil War affected their development. And we found that there were many, many discrete types of exposure to war, but they clustered into 4 big groups. Some kids were actively involved, some kids lost a parent, some kids were passively involved, and some kids had limited involvement, and some kids had combinations of each of these things. What we discovered was, in a way, not surprising. There's a long literature that says that children's separation from their parents can lead to depression, and that being a victim of violence can lead to PTSD. But separation also had a positive impact in increasing kids' feelings of being, behaviors of being pro-social. And so adaptation is complex in these situations too. There's some negative effects, but there's some positive ones too. And this is a quite controversial idea. Similarly, loss, when children are displaced, they become less planful, but bereavement can actually also lead to children becoming more pro-social. Indeed, my speculation is that care providers have experienced separation and loss early and bereavement early in their life and predisposed to becoming early childhood workers and therapists and things like that. So there are positive as well as negative adaptations. And finally, witnessing violence can help children become more planful. You can see how that is a positive adaptation that kids are making in the face of these challenges. So the implications for ECE are, this is my main point, that if we want to understand the adaptive capacity for resilience of children who've experienced complex and mass trauma in the context of these types of complex exposures, we really need to be thinking about the fundamental human adaptive systems not only in individuals, but in relationships, in families, communities, and cultures. We can't do what people seem to think, which is convey the impression that to effectively respond to trauma-related conditions, it's necessary to have advanced therapeutic skills and years of formal study. If we consign effective care and therapeutic work to highly educated, skilled clinicians, we will almost have defined a problem unsolvable because there isn't the scope for that. It's deeper than that, though. Healing can take place in non-clinical settings, and indeed there's evidence to suggest that trauma-informed living environments can take place and are necessary precursor to any formal therapy, a necessary precursor. So from my point of view, early childhood education and care programs are one of those trauma-informed living environments that can promote healing and growth and that are a precursor to clinical work. Indeed, as Bath suggests, all who interact with traumatized children in home, in school, and elsewhere can make a contribution. This work, which you can read about through the references I share, really take on the notion that we should be strengthening three pillars of trauma-informed care: safety, connections, and managing emotional impulses. All of you who work in early childhood know the fundamental importance of those phenomena. And for kids who haven't been traumatized, well, for kids who have been facing complex and mass traumas, these are as or more important. So the argument I've been developing in my short time with you is to say that we have now a evidence-informed literature on clinical interventions that address 3 of the 6 components of what a care system should be addressing: attachment, regulation, competence. But we also need a setting level or ecology level, early childhood level of interventions on mass trauma that promote safety, the management of emotional impulses, and developing interpersonal connections, positive interpersonal connections. It is setting level strategies to promote them that I think early childhood is uniquely positioned to address, and the implications for practice in the end are working at 2 levels: working at the clinical level, treating complex trauma by addressing systems within persons, those domains within persons, and working at the setting level by addressing issues between persons and their settings, like early childhood settings. Thank you for giving me a chance to explore these ideas with you, and I look forward to our discussion when the time comes, a little later in the hour. I did want to alert you to two major international initiatives that are going on related to all this. One is an early childhood peace building consortium led by Paul Conley at Queen's University, and another is a major set of strategies being developed for Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and Lebanon, led by the International Rescue Committee, Sesame Workshop, and my co-director at Global Ties, Hiro Yoshikawa. You'll be able to find most of the references I cited on the website as well. Thank you, Maki.
Thank you so much, Larry, for condensing such a vast amount of rich information into such a concise presentation. I think this really sets up perfectly to understand the vital role that early childhood programs and systems can play in responding to refugee children's needs, and also just really refuting this misunderstanding that many might still hold that very young children are simply too young to be affected by trauma. I will just remind all of our participants that we will be fielding questions in the last 20 minutes or so of the call, so please do continue to send those in. I think we are now primed to hear from our next speaker, Heather Savazzi, who is the Content Development Team Lead at CMAS, which is an organization that she'll be introducing to us shortly. We're very grateful to be able to learn from her firsthand experience working alongside refugee children and families, as well as providing consultation and expertise to the Care for Newcomer Children program in Canada. Thanks so much for joining us, Heather. Over to you.
Wonderful, thank you. Let me just get this switched over. Thank you so much for having us here today. It really is an honor to be here. I'm gonna flip slides here. I just wanted to start off our time together here by providing you with a little bit of context. Immigration has really made Canada what it is today, a country that is diverse, prosperous, and welcoming to those in need. With one of the highest immigration rates per capita, over 250,000 immigrants and refugees arriving to Canada from almost 200 countries each year, and a commitment to at least 300,000 a year moving forward, we have a fundamental commitment to providing assistance to recently arrived immigrants and supporting the successful settlement and integration of newcomer families. Once families have arrived, newcomers have access to language training and a wide range of settlement services that are funded by Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, IRCC. From reception centers where some families first stay to the language classes, job search workshops, counseling, and a multitude of other supports. While parents are accessing language training and settlement services, many organizations are also funded to provide on-site childcare called Care for Newcomer Children, or CNC. There are over 230 IRCC-funded Care for Newcomer Children programs across Canada. These CNC programs care for over 6,000 children while their parents receive on-site help from settlement, language, and employment programs. These programs are often one of the first points of contact for a family in their new community, and all of these programs work with CMAS. CMAS is funded by IRCC to monitor and support Care for Newcomer Children. We do this by establishing and measuring the standards of care, working with Care for Newcomer Children programs to build quality, and by supporting services for newcomer families through resource development and training. We've been doing this for almost 20 years, so our organization has really taken the lead in providing supports for the settlement and care of young immigrant and refugee children for many organizations across Canada over the years. Through our work in second language acquisition, trauma and resilience, separation practices, and best practices when working with newcomer children, we continue to help organizations across the country to work towards successful settlement outcomes for newcomer families everywhere. With the crisis in Syria, Canada made a huge commitment to contribute and to welcome as many Syrian families as we could. Community organizations, families, and church groups created a wave of assistance that led to many refugee families coming to Canada. And as part of our role in leading the settlement of young children, we collaborated with experts to develop the Caring for Syrian Refugee Children program guide for welcoming young children and their families. With the influx of refugee families, organizations and communities were faced with many families who'd experienced significant trauma. It showed up in our child care programs along with all of our other services. Staff expressed great concerns for the health and general well-being of children and families, which led us down a path of seeking solutions. So in 2017, last year, 2017, we had the honor and privilege of collaborating with leading experts in the fields of settlement, childhood trauma, and resilience, and launched our newest resource, the Resilience Guide, Strategies for Responding to Trauma in Refugee Children. And we've been traveling coast to coast doing workshops. The more research and consultation that we do, the more programs that we visit, the more we understand how early years programs and staff are uniquely positioned to help refugee families with young children as they cope with the effects of trauma. So similar to what Larry just referred to as well, we don't need advanced therapeutic skills to help. I love how you said that, Larry. We just need to be there, and we need to be doing some of the things that we're already doing. So many of the things we already do in the early childhood programs not only support healthy child development, but also strengthen the capacity for resilience and set the stage for recovery in young children and families who've experienced forced migration. Another one of the things that Larry kind of just alluded to is that just during critical stages of development, children who've experienced forced migration often find themselves in complex situations of extreme stress and adversity. This stress impacts a child's automatic reactions, as well as how they perceive, interpret, and interact with the world. War and forced migration teaches children things like nowhere is safe, people are capable of cruelty, they have no control, even their parents sometimes have no control. To change these kinds of automatic fear and stress responses and perceptions of the world that have developed during war and forced migration, we need to provide children with experiences that directly contradict what their body and brain has learned to date. And we can do this by becoming more intentional in our interactions and programming to create responsive, trauma-informed early learning and childcare programs. In working with children who've been through trauma, experts often talk about fighting stress and strengthening attachment and call these the therapeutic bookends. These are some of the most important things that we do for the children in our care. Actually, many of the things we talk about here today won't come as a surprise, but as we become more aware of how they can support children in building resilience, we can kind of dial up the dose for the children who need it most. So we work with our programs and encourage them to use these 4 strategies for supporting healthy child development and strengthening the capacity for resilience and recovery in young refugee children who've experienced trauma. To foster resilience and support the refugee families in our programs, we try to do 4 things: create safe, predictable spaces, build relationships and secure attachment, help children understand big feelings and challenging behaviors, and provide opportunities for hopefulness, mastery, and success. There's so much that we can do in each of these areas and so many strategies that I'd love to share, but for today's purposes, I'm just going to go over each of these strategies quickly. Early learning and childcare programs feel safe and predictable when they have predictable routines, clear expectations and boundaries, and a consistent caregiver. Children feel safer when they know what to expect and have clear expectations and boundaries. This means creating a welcoming program where children are encouraged but not forced to participate. It helps to minimize clutter and create a welcoming entry where a child and parent can observe the program and join in at their own pace. Refugee children and families will also feel safer if you use a reliable caregiver and routine and let them know as early as possible if there are any changes. And many of you probably already know that it helps to use a visual schedule and minimize the use of language when the child first arrives, unless, of course, you have a shared language. It also helps to adjust your approach and expectations and try to be really attuned and sensitive to each child's needs. When the child is ready, you can guide them through their daily routine, introduce them to the activities and expectations, and generally support their interactions with the other children. Studies also show that consistent, supportive relationships are one of the most important protective factors in helping children who've been exposed to trauma. So using consistent caregivers, practicing gradual separation, and developing relationships with the parent and children can be some of the most important things that you can do. Over time, predictable and safe can lead to attachment, which leads us right into the next strategy, building relationships and supporting secure attachment. Relationships are key. They're so important. When young children who've experienced forced migration have reliable, supportive adults in their lives, they're much more likely to learn how to self-soothe in stressful situations and manage their feelings and behavior. which in turn helps us to better support their development, settlement, healing, and resilience. The refugee children in your care will be better able to develop relationships and trust when you ensure a gradual separation between parent and child. Gradual separation means increasing the length of separations as the child becomes more comfortable in the program. This is best supported by one reliable caregiver, especially for infants and toddlers. On our website, we have lots more information on how to handle gradual separation, as well as a parent resource that explains gradual separation and why it's important, and it's available in over 40 languages. It's also important for us to recognize the parents as the child's primary source of comfort and security, and to find ways to support them in their parenting. Again, our website is full of information and resources for parents in their home languages on topics like routines, what to do if my child's having nightmares, aggression, and lots more. We also need to carefully observe and get to know each child and look for signs that might indicate that they need a quiet space or an opportunity for active play, then provide alternative activities to avoid upset and disruption. It's also really important to listen carefully and with interest, even if the child is speaking another language. Try to respond in genuinely encouraging and positive ways, and maybe learn the phrase, "show me," in the home language. Then you can use it to let the child know that you think that what they have to say is important, even if you don't understand it yet. It's also important to remember that children may be sensitive to touch. Never approach a child from behind and touch them on the back, even if it's just to provide comfort. Instead, make sure to always approach a child from where they can see you. Supporting secure attachment means supporting the child's attachment to their parents and family, but it also might mean being a surrogate, being that calm, compassionate, and reliable caregiver that the child needs in times when a parent might be struggling or not available to meet the child's basic needs for safety and secure attachment. When parents feel confident and supported, they're much more likely to be able to support their family's successful settlement, and there's lots that you can do to support them around that. The next resilience building strategy I'd like to talk about is helping children understand and manage big feelings and challenging behaviors. Excuse me. It can be difficult to help some refugee children attain and maintain that optimal state of alert calm that allows them to engage in play and learning, especially when sometimes they might be finding it hard to understand and express emotions and control their reactions to threats, whether real or perceived, or trauma reminders or triggers. This might mean that a child seems aggressive and disruptive, or maybe even passive and unable to engage in play. It's important to realize that what we sometimes think of as misbehavior is actually stress behavior. It's very difficult to consciously control or change stress behavior. In these moments, it's not that the child won't behave, it's actually that they can't behave. No matter what behavior the child is displaying, really what you are seeing is just the tip of the iceberg for children who've been through trauma. Below the surface are the feelings, thoughts, expectations, and beliefs that the children have accumulated as a result of their experiences. So to keep everyone in our programs emotionally and physically safe, we need to help children understand feelings and give them tools and strategies for managing big feelings and some of these automatic responses. Obviously, we need to be culturally sensitive and remember that each child is different. What works well in helping one child to handle intense feelings may not work for another, but generally, all of the children in our programs are going to benefit if we are proactive and observe closely, get to know triggers, and really step in to help children self-regulate before emotions and behaviors escalate. It can also be really helpful to schedule regular, preventative, calming activities throughout the day. For example, rhythmic activities can be wonderful. Things like rolling a ball back and forth, drumming, knitting, coloring, all of these things can be very calming and meditative. The rhythm and cadence of reading is also very calming and attachment building. We can also provide lots of opportunities for sensory, creative, and physical play. Focus on social-emotional development in quiet, teachable moments, and make sure to validate and label emotions. We can also create a special, quiet, safe space to go to. This might be a hammock under a table or even just a cozy, quiet box to retreat to. You might also want to provide children with sensory bottles or earphones with white noise, quiet music, or nature sounds. For infants and toddlers, this means focusing on consistently and reliably meeting the child's physical needs. The more you can anticipate a child's needs before they get upset, the better. And we all know how powerful a good role model is for young children. Every day we have lots of opportunities to set a good example in how we're managing our own feelings. We just have a few minutes left to touch on the last resilience strategy, providing opportunities for mastery and success. When parents and children who've experienced forced migration come to our programs, they are rarely feeling their best, most confident selves. They might be feeling unsure of themselves and their abilities. Their sense of self, confidence, and competence can be deeply affected by their experiences. Refugee children need supportive relationships, a safe space, and opportunities to nurture and regain their confidence and feelings of competence. They need to be reminded that they can do things that are hard, overcome challenges, take age-appropriate risks, and generally have a positive impact on outcomes. We can help children feel more confident and competent by providing opportunities for them to make choices, think and act independently, participate in physical activity, and engage in safe, age-appropriate risks. Participate in activities that are challenging, but also some that are just fun and easy to master. It's also important to help children focus on the positives, overcome challenges, and learn from their mistakes. There's so much more that I'd love to share in terms of concrete strategies, but we're coming to the end of our time, my time here to chat. You can find lots more strategies in the Resilience Guide and helpful resources on the CMAS website, though. So, excuse me, just to wrap up, research and experience shows us that all of these strategies and key concepts that we've discussed today can be incredibly powerful, even in imperfect environments and programs. In some of our other workshops, we show a little 3-minute video. You can do a quick search online if you'd like. It's called Hiba's Story, a 10-year-old Syrian refugee girl. And in this little video, there's a little girl telling her story. She's in a refugee camp with most of her family intact, where she has access to basic necessities, and there's a schedule and school, at least a new sense of kind of normalcy and structure to her day. And this little girl, Hiba, smiles when she talks about going to school and learning 3 new languages. She talks about how she likes to sing and sing and write and draw. She talks about being strong and competent and how one day she plans to be a teacher. And she tells us that her future is very bright. The spark of resilience and message of hope in her story in this video is incredibly strong. Every time you get a child to learn and play, there is hope. And I love that, and I think it's worth repeating. Every time you get a child to learn and play, there is hope. And that's what our Care for Newcomer Children programs are doing every day. And I really would like to say that I have so much respect for the work that is done each day in our programs. It has tremendous long-term positive impact on the lives of so many children and families who have experienced forced migration. Because we didn't have a lot of time here together today, and I'm used to delivering at least a full workshop on the topic and really had to keep to point, I really didn't have time to skim over so many of the stories and strategies that we usually share. So I thought I'd just let you know that if you go to our website at cmascanada.ca, you can find a lot more resources to support your work with immigrant and refugee families with young children. You might find the multilingual resources for parents helpful. Many are available in over 20 languages and include topics like gradual separation, aggression, getting ready for kindergarten, dental hygiene, nightmares, and more. And of course, I've just lost my screen here. We also have the Caring for Syrian Refugee Guide. Sorry, my notes have closed on me, so I'm just going to go to my backup so I make sure to not miss anything. We also have the Caring for Syrian Refugee Children Program Guide, which provides the knowledge and tools you need to better understand and respond to the unique experiences and needs of Syrian refugee children. And we have the Resilience Guide. It's full of information and resources to help you understand the impact of the refugee experience at different ages, developmental effects of trauma and resettlement, and key strategies to strengthen families' capacity for resilience. Both of these resources are written to be very user-friendly and full of real-life strategies. They include practical tip sheets designed to easily print out and share with your team. We also have a variety of other tip sheets that are designed to be taken straight off the page and put into practice. We also design training and webinars to help people working in this sector to be more responsive to the needs of immigrant and refugee families. In the Online Learning Center, you can find a number of free online tutorials and courses, and you can also request training for your team. I'd just like to wrap up by saying that your support can truly make a world of difference for families with young children who have experienced forced migration. And I hope you leave here today feeling respected, honored, empowered, and able to continue helping families as they build a solid foundation for successful settlement as they begin to build a new life. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules this afternoon, and thank you again for having us, everyone.
Great. Thank you so much, Heather. Really just so powerful to hear about the exciting work that's happening through CMAS and the CNC program. And we're really grateful to be able to share this information with the U.S. and international audience in hopes that we're able to spur greater action and initiative here in the States and really learn from all these valuable resources that your team has put together. So we have about a little less than 20 minutes left to address questions from you all. Again, we would invite you to use the Q&A function on your screen or email events@migrationpolicy.org to send us your questions. We have a few questions lined up here to begin with. And I'll start first, Heather, with a direct follow-up to some of the multilingual resources that you were sharing just now. You touched a little bit on the issue of language access, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to how in the day-to-day your programs handle the multilingual nature of the families and the young children coming into your programs. And relatedly, for either or both speakers, just knowing how diverse the refugee population is, and that, you know, they do often share this experience of trauma and yet have many very different underlying characteristics. And I wonder if one of you could also speak to how services might need to be differentiated depending on the experiences and the backgrounds that refugee families are bringing into the classroom. So Heather, could we start with you?
Sure, and I'll maybe speak specifically to the, I think you were referring to just so many languages in the different programs and working with families that you don't necessarily have a shared language with. Is that accurate? Am I thinking of that?
Exactly, yes.
I've seen programs do an amazing job of that, and oftentimes, well, many of our program staff has been in the field for years, and I see that they develop these little cheat sheets, and they often will engage the parents, and it's kind of empowering for the parents as well to be able to ask them words in their home language, like really useful words like toileting words and water and thirsty, and so really basic necessity type words that they'll ask parents to translate for them and then use them in their program. Also using things like the resource sheets that we have to engage parents and help them to understand some of the initial and important information. Having that translated and available can really help bridge that gap. Having access to translators is often one of a key piece, having access to people who speak the home language. So those are some of the tools. I've seen some of our programs. I was in one program and actually saw her success, one of the ECEs successfully engage a group of children. There were about 12 children, and there were 6 languages represented in the group. And she was doing a story time with them. And simply by finding out key words, like I don't remember what the story was about, but if there's a little bear or if there's key words in the story, finding out how to say those simple words in each of the children's home language, she was able to keep this group of 12 children fully engaged in the story. Obviously, she wasn't reading every word on each page, but she had this beautiful book that she had the children all engaged in and did incorporate at least a word or two in each of the languages. And again, that's a very experienced caregiver who has been doing this for a long time and obviously has a lot of expertise in this area and has learned over the years a few key words in different languages. But it can be done, and if you know the languages represented in your program, then that is something that you can do to incorporate other languages into your program. Does that answer that question?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Heather. We have a question for Larry. You mentioned, Larry, some of the work that's being done in humanitarian settings. And we have a question about where already you might see elsewhere in the world, perhaps in humanitarian settings, have you actually experienced two-generation intervention programs or any other type of program that are serving children that really demonstrate an understanding of these paradigms of mass and complex trauma? And, you know, just is there something we can learn from some of the global initiatives that you have experience with, and how can we bring pieces of that back to the U.S.?
Great question, thanks. The reason I shared the slide with the Early Childhood Peace Building Consortium is that they are using practices that were originally identified and validated in Belfast, Northern Ireland during the Troubles, and beginning to work with early childhood people in 6 different countries in Asia and Africa and the Middle East, Paul Conley. And the Sesame Workshop and IRC initiative in the Middle East, these are initiatives that are using the concepts, but they're still helping to go from good practices or promising practices to evidence-based practices. So one of the things I feel very strongly about is that all kids deserve for us not to guess what is good for them when we don't have to guess. We should try to identify strategies that are strong and confident strategies, and how to develop assessment tools and evaluation tools that are useful to practitioners as well as evaluators. So to your earlier question about the need to differentiate experiences for children with different types of responses to trauma, I completely agree with that. And in that literature I shared, there are implications for basically assessments. How much more is the child concerned about attachment than they are showing challenges with self-regulation. So we can do assessments of individual kids to help guide priorities in practice. And then the final thing I'll say is early childhood programs have an enormous opportunity to videotape their classrooms with privacy and confidentiality guaranteed, and to look at the nature of their practices and to develop rubrics so that they could improve the setting's ability to support kids in this way. We can really develop a culture of learning how to make these practices as powerful and positive as possible.
Great, thank you so much, Larry.
I think the other piece, if I could just add to that as well, is just getting past just looking at the behavior as behavior. Really seeing behavior as a communication tool. The child is communicating something in their behavior. So it's really easy to get caught up in managing behavior. And I would suggest that when you're working with children who've experienced trauma, it's really important that we're looking at that behavior as something that may not be something that they can manage on their own, and they may need some strategies, and it's not a quick fix that's going to happen, but really looking behind that behavior and seeing how you can support that child in
what you were saying earlier, Heather, which is that the children's behaviors make sense. I mean, there's sense to it. They are communicating, and it's thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and relationships all tied together. I agree.
Yeah, I think that really is the bottom line takeaway of this whole conversation. Thanks so much to you both. I think stepping back again to kind of a more systems level, not surprisingly, Heather, we're getting a lot of questions and comments about how amazing it is that Canada provides these resources to begin with, and how different the resettlement process, it seems, looks in Canada as compared with the refugee resettlement process here in the U.S. And we have a question about the duration of services provided by CNC to families, and to the degree that you can talk about where the resources come from and what that looks like at a national scale. I think there's a lot of curiosity around that as well.
Wow, that's a really big question. And some of it I may not be able to answer as fully as I would like to, but how long the service is, it really depends. Different services are offered for different it depends on so many factors. Many families are accessing different types of services, from when they're in, some families will come to the welcome centers when they first arrive and they actually live on site, and then they might move into accessing other language classes first, and then they might move on to, once they've gone through the different levels of language classes, they may then access settlement services and job search training and workshops. And so really it depends on the services that families are accessing and needing. So the length or duration, it isn't necessarily dependent on, like there's no tried and true definitive date when everything is cut off that I'm aware of in terms of the services that are provided. And where is funding coming from? This Care for Newcomer Children is funded nationally by Immigration, Refugee, and Citizenship Canada. So our programs are funded nationally. There are some community organizations that are also supplemented in other ways, but the programs are funded through Immigration, Refugee, and Citizenship Canada federally.
Great. A lot for us to aspire to here in the U.S. Going back to a practice level, we have a question about teacher competencies, also a big issue. Just wondering, Heather, if you could speak to what kind of specialized training and qualification requirements you have for the ECEC practitioners that work in the CNC program, and if also whether there are specialized developmental screening instruments as part of the program overall.
Most of our Care for Newcomer Children staff, many of them have their early childhood education diploma. So there's different requirements for Care for Newcomer Children. We have something called Care for Newcomer Children requirements. And so they are required, each program is required to have at least one early childhood educator on staff. Many of our programs are entirely staffed by early childhood educators. Many of our programs have a lot of women, a lot of people who are actually, they were at one point a newcomer themselves. They were new to Canada, they maybe had teacher training back home, or something in a social work field, or some of them were engineers or even doctors. But when they came here to Canada, they retrained, they spent time in settlement services, and sometimes their children were accessing the child care supports, and then they moved into working in these programs as well. Some of our CNC staff have been working in programs for 20 years or longer. And these are some of there's so much expertise in these programs, and it is based on the experience. They're the ones in the programs every day. And part of my role over the last 10 years has been tapping into all of the expertise that is there and visiting programs and seeing how they're managing. So a lot of it comes from experience. All of our programs are very well connected. We try to do a good job of connecting everyone online in terms of just sharing promising practices, sharing resources. Back when I started 10 years ago, it was really difficult for me to find new weekly content to post on our website and support our programs, but we have a monthly newsletter that goes out and just shares everything that is new on the website, which is always at least 8 to 10 new things that are on the website. And most of the CNC staff is really good, and the administrators as well of the programs. They do a really good job of just staying up to date. We do the tutorials. They get together and do, I believe they are required to do 5 hours of professional development every year. And a lot of them use many of the CMAS resources in order to do that. We do workshops out in the community and travel coast to coast, visiting programs and doing full-day trainings. So the specialized training has kind of come from the sector and the field themselves. We're creating it, and we're trying to do as much research and connect with experts in different fields to provide them with the resources and training that they need. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you, Heather. Thank you. We have a question from someone who's working in home visiting interventions, and they have mentioned, and this is something that we've seen, across the refugee service field, that often there is this really noticeable gap in services for the youngest children, where there are many more school-based interventions for refugee families for children, and just fewer in the early childhood space. And a question for both of you, whether you're aware of, either within your own program, Heather, or elsewhere, examples of home visiting interventions that are being done that are targeted toward refugee families and also being evaluated in terms of our ability to draw lessons learned from some of these programs.
I don't know of any that are specific. Yeah, maybe you go ahead and speak to that, Larry.
Okay. The Sesame project is done a very extensive review of home visiting programs that work in low and middle income countries in different situations, and has identified a Jamaican model called Reach Up and Learn, and which Susan Walker led in Jamaica, all the work on that, and has in turn begun to adapt it for use with refugee infants and toddlers and their families in Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq. And so the one that I know is most ambitiously trying to take a very strong evidence-based approach that's been demonstrated to be effective in one country and adapting it to refugee populations is the Sesame Seeds home visiting part of the project. But Heather, you may know things more on the North American continent.
The only thing that comes to mind for me is CAPC, and it's been around for a long time, Community Action Program for Children, and it's Canada-wide as far as I understand, and it's 0 to 6, but I know that even 20 years ago when I started out in the field, they were doing home visiting, a lot of parenting programs. Nobody's perfect. There were a lot of different programs, and I know I have more recently in the last couple of years gone out to BC, British Columbia, to do some training out there for home visitors. And they actually work with the public health department. So there's some different departments working in that area of the very early years. So there are different programs. CAPC is something you might want to look into, but I don't know a lot of details about that right now.
Great, thanks so much to you both. I think we have time for one final question, and I think this one at the practice level will likely go to Heather. So it's a question about cultural disciplinary practices, which can be, of course, culturally impacted, but also impacted by the experience of trauma, and that might differ really dramatically from Western practices. And a concern that families may not trust mainstream caregivers because of the difference in disciplinary approaches. And wondering if you could speak to that quickly, Heather.
Yeah, it's really challenging. North American parenting practices can be different. I think I would just say that, well, if you have concerns about parenting practices that are culturally diverse and different from what you're comfortable with, we do have, like, struggling to communicate with parents some of the expectations for here in Canada or the U.S. We do have some resources for parents in home languages on aggression and behavior management, that kind of thing. So you might want to check out those to have on hand. But I would say developing a relationship, I mean, obviously if it crosses the line to dangerous and needing to contact child welfare, then that's a different story. But if it's just something that you've never seen, or you're not 100% comfortable with, or you're not sure, then really trying to do an observation and not make assumptions right off the get-go, because sometimes there are parenting practices, there are different parenting practices all over the world, and some of them might not make sense to our brains right now, like on an initial view, but if you really look into it, the practices have value, and sometimes I've even questioned or thought something was different and maybe a little strange, but when I really heard the reasoning behind it and got to know the parents, got to know the family, as long as it's not endangering the child, I would really encourage people to explore it a little further before making judgment. And
if I may jump in, Heather, my apologies. I completely agree with what you said, and I'll note one exception, which is people have been looking both in this country and across the world in the effects of one of those practices, corporal punishment on kids. And it's controversial. People hold many different cultural opinions. but the best evidence suggests that there is no place in the world where corporal punishment actually promotes kids' long-term development and self-regulation. In cultures where it's more normative, the impact is a little less negative than in cultures where it's very non-normative. But there is no place in the world where it is positive that we've studied so far. And I think, so this mix of trying to understand the practices, but some of the practices may be just not good for kids.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much,
Steve. If you are trying to help a parent to manage and to shift the way that they are managing, baby steps is the other thing. If you try and jump in and change everything right off the bat, you might be damaging a relationship. Whereas if you can get them to work towards baby steps and modeling appropriate or modeling what different strategies, you're going to get a lot further.
Good point.
Absolutely. I'm sorry to say that that's about all the time that we have for the discussion today. For those of you who have questions that have remained unanswered, I do apologize as we just received too many to address in the time we had, but we will follow up with each of you with responses and coordinate with speakers. A reminder, too, that we'll be holding a second in-depth conversation on this issue on September 13th, so we invite you all to join us once more as you're able. And also wanted to let you know that the slides and audio from today's webinar will be available on our website. Also, for those of you who are asking about specific promising practices in the U.S. as well as in Europe, the report that I mentioned today is available for download on MPI's website or at the address on the screen, and has a number of promising practice as part of the report itself. And then finally, for any reporters on the call who have further questions, please reach out to our Communications Director, Michelle Middlestat, at 202-266-1910. So thank you again so much to everyone for joining us, and especially to our two speakers, Larry and Heather. Thank you for your excellent and informative presentations.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.